Well, everyone, it's my favorite time of the year, Halloween, and I thought what better opportunity to discuss with all of you some of my favorite subjects of spirit communication, seances, mediumship, the history of Ouija boards, talking boards, and the science of how that might be possible. But first, let's look at the history of how far these things go back. We have to go back even into the biblical texts where we get a story about the Witch of Endor. Now, this took place in the book of Samuel, in the Bible, when King Saul wanted to contact the prophet Samuel. So he finds the Witch of Endor and they make contact with the shade, or what was the energy remaining of Samuel that has some characteristics of him, and they give information back to him. And now that's what theologians say, because they don't truly believe that he made contact, or some say, okay, maybe he did. We see dozens of other examples in the Bible of spirit communication, mediumship, and whatnot. Some of the most famous is Jesus said, everything I can do, so can you. If you're looking at Jesus in more than an allegorical sense, you can see that, of course, he raised Lazarus from the dead. And so he was bringing the dead back to life in there. That's sort of a necromancy. And then we also see where he was having conversations with Moses and Elijah, and he took them up after they had already been dead and communicated with them. The Bible makes innumerable references to what are known as familiar spirits, or hang-arounds that come around people. And of course, we also have a reference in 1 John 4:1 where it says, "Dear friends, do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits to see whether they are from God, because many false prophets have gone out into the world." And with that verse, again, it talks about testing the spirits. So it's telling you that whenever you're having spirit communication, that you're sensing it, you're feeling it, you're perceiving it beyond the senses, you're testing the information. You're asking it questions. You're seeking to find out its source. And so we know these things have been mentioned many times throughout the biblical texts. But of course, then we have to ask ourselves, if there was a Witch of Endor, where did she learn her abilities from? There must have been other witches like her that passed down the abilities. Now, when we look at who these people were, and we go back into the ancient Sumerians, we learn about a story of a very primitive people. And you can go see all this cuneiform writing and start to trace back the history over at the British Museum, as we did recently. And what you learn is that they couldn't even start fires. They lived in straw huts. And at one point, they had a visitor, and his name was Dagon, or Oannes. And he arrived on their shores, and he had this fish hat on, which the Pope, of course, wears this hat that's known as a mitre. And as he arrived, he was a good man and taught them all about, building a society, and brought with him all sorts of ideas about agriculture, which is why they also call him Sidon, and built up their society. And of course, we hear of other stories of great visitors that started coming around in the ancient aliens community. They've had stories about the Anunnaki, those who came from heaven. We hear stories about the sons of God, or the Watchers, in the apocryphal book of Enoch, teaching the daughters of man the secrets of sorcery, of medicine, of writing, and they were taught all of these abilities on how to access extrasensory perception or consciousness-based technologies. So we have this great society built up, and of course we know the story, how it went forth, the Sumerians, and then with the Akkadians, the Assyrians, then later into the Babylonians, and along the way we had Sargon the Great of Akkad. When we go forward to Babylon, we learn about a story in the Bible of Daniel. And Daniel is another guy who was able to interpret dreams, and he had these extrasensory perceptions with King Nebuchadnezzar, and he was later given the title Belteshazzar because he was presiding over sorcery and great abilities with all the psychics. Now, the Christians will tell you, if you talk to them, that, hey, Daniel, it sounds like a choir boy that he was doing all these great deeds, but he was actually overseeing some of the darkest occult psychic stuff that there was in the Bible. That's Babylon. It doesn't get any darker than that. So we see these abilities mentioned all throughout the biblical texts. And as we go forward, of course, we see at about 1000 CE or AD, Anno Domini, the year of our Lord, or the Common Era, we learn in the Song dynasty in China that they used a planchette or a type of an automatic writing, and this has been used by spiritualists and mediums and whatnot to communicate with other dimensions using a pen or writing, or you'd see a pointer that would come across and start to bring a spiritual doorway or a connection out of the subconscious. And all throughout history, we've seen examples of great mystics and sorcerers and priestess, even at the Oracle of Delphi, all throughout Egypt. And every one of these major empires has had mystics and those who could see into other realms and give messages from the dead. And as we move into the 19th century of Europe, we know it was commonplace for people to have these spirit communication sessions and seances and mediumship and getting messages from the dead and sharing those messages in the newspaper. In fact, you'd get together with your friends on a Saturday night, you'd have your session, and then the messages that you received would be in the paper the next day. And those were very different pastimes back then, because we know that even in Sir Arthur Conan Doyle's story of Sherlock Holmes, I mean, he was doing cocaine while he was solving his murder mysteries. And people could go to the corner store and pick that stuff up for pennies, and cocaine and hashish and opium, and they were attending these spiritualist sessions. And, you know, we hear all these fantastic stories of their imaginations being lit up. But in those days, we also see all sorts of different traditions popping up in Western mysticism. We see the rise of the Golden Dawn, the likes of Aleister Crowley coming along. We see Madame Blavatsky. And because of those movements, there we saw the spirit board phenomena. And it was born out of the automatic writing, which included the pen in the planchette. That's the French word for it, that was writing as it moved along. So you'd sort of come along with a device like this, a pointer, a planchette, which, by the way, when you look at the French and the German for ya or ja, and also the oui for, you know, the French for yes, that's where we get the name for this, cleverly named. And you just kind of write as you go along and communicate out of the subconscious mind. Now, a similar technique is used with these Ouija boards when we also look over at the pendulum. And the pendulum is commonly used still by some psychologists. It's also used in clinical hypnotherapy. Not how you might think. It's not like this for an induction to make you go to sleep. Although maybe if you're a very clever hypnotist like Bugs Bunny, you can do that. But essentially with the pendulum, you just sit still and allow yourself to subtly ask it a question, and it will move up and down or in a circle or counterclockwise to give you a yes or no. And this is similar to how the mechanism of action works on these Ouija boards or talking boards. And by the way, the pendulum and other dowsing and divination tools can be used to contact spirit. One example might be you might write down various answers on a piece of paper and have the pendulum dangle over it, or ask it simple questions. Another means might be for your divination tools is that you might use bibliomancy, opening up a book to get an answer and have the subconscious connecting with that aspect of that reality of those hyperdimensional intelligences. We might look at it as you could use tarot cards to communicate. The subconscious, again, is connected to all aspects of matter, and you are bringing the arrangement together in such a way where you're having that communication facilitated. I mean, these things, again, have been used for a very long time. As you know, the Bible had the Urim and the Thummim on the breastplate of the priests, color-changing stones. They used broken arrowheads, multicolored types of sand. There's so many different means of doing this, but the principle should be looked at it like this, is that these are just tools, even the Ouija board, just a tool. And ideally, the practitioner should seek to transcend these things like training wheels and be able to practice on their own without the need of any of these tools. Now with the talking board, people have made their own. I know I most certainly have made my own before. I used to be fascinated by them. And one of the interesting things about them is that when I was growing up, we weren't allowed to have anything to do with the New Age or the occult in our house. I grew up in a very religious home, so I remember in grade 4, I used to run over to the library in our elementary school, and I'd go pull out the World Book and Britannica Encyclopedia on my lunch hour and a piece of loose leaf, and I'd take out my little pencil and I'd write all these notes that I'd get about the history of the Ouija board, and as it came back with Elijah Bond and William Fuld and their business and marketing plans with the Ouija board, and how it became a huge part of the 19th century, and the movement that took off even into World War I, with people using these as a divination device, as a communication device to talk to the spirit world, as well as it was used as basically a parlor game before that. And I think with the Ouija board, it's a very fascinating tool. And we can't dismiss it for a tool to the subconscious, a tool to the spirit world. I really truly believe, as I'm going to tell you all today with some of my theories on the science of spirit communication, theoretically speaking, that how spirit communicates to us is through the imagination. And when we look at this tool, we can't dismiss the automatic writing factor and how the planchette works. In fact, if you look at how Ellen G. White from the Seventh-day Adventist Church wrote a lot of her books, she said that a force moved through her. She just picked up her pen and was writing on these books that had written themselves. That's how she came up with her material. I also believe that, these tools can be used to tap into the subconscious, to tap into other realms. What we have to look at is that, yes, there might be a sympathetic, vibrational relationship that they could have with a certain energy or an entity. So that's why people in the occult often talk about cleansing these boards, using some sort of means to take the energy and to neutralize it each time. Well, it doesn't necessarily form a bond or a relationship with an entity or an energy. There's a reason for that, and I'm going to get into it today. But first of all, when we look at spirit communication using these boards, usually they are more effective when you have more than one person, you have a willing participant, and energy is put forth, or the questions are asked in such a way where you're calling on them to have more accuracy. And I also want to emphasize that these tools produce infinitely better results when you open yourself up to the experience. You know, George Bernard Shaw said, imagination is the beginning of creation. You imagine what you desire, you will have what you imagine, and at last you create what you will. And Einstein very famously said, imagination is everything. It is the preview of life's coming attractions. So when we open ourselves up to these experiences, great things happen. Also, we really can't leave this topic without talking about spiritualist pioneers like Pascal Beverly Randolph, who was part African American, by the way, that introduced a lot of these mystical spiritism ideas into America with seances and sex magic and all sorts of different occult ideas. And we see these sweeping the nation as they were coming in. With the spiritualist movement and their churches that started coming up, some will link them to some of these other organizations like the Fabian Society and other agendas. But for the most part, it's very interesting when you look at the spiritualist church, because there's usually a minister present, and I know some spiritualist ministers, like my dear friend and psychic medium Matthew Stapley, who lives in Ottawa. And if you ever want a connection to spirit, by the way, he's the guy to talk to. He does amazing work. But when you go to a spiritualist church, they usually have fresh fruits out. Sometimes the red light, which is often used in seances as well for grounding or enhancing spirit communication. You will also see that everybody will sing a song and raise the energy up, and the medium will walk around and give messages to people and will call out a name, and then you'll test the spirits and verify the information, and it'll be just like a regular church service, but they're everywhere, by the way, and they give people a lot of healing, a lot of closure, and it's basically a psychic church. It's very interesting. And these concepts are taught within their organization, that you'll come on a Wednesday night or a mediumship night, usually in the basement where they're serving tea and coffee, and you'll go into a little meditation room and you'll work with spirit. Now, I believe that how spirit communication works through you or through the medium is that each and every single one of us is a multidimensional being. I believe that each and every single one of us is a portal. We're a portal that spirit can come in and out of. And I believe that our lives are more enhanced when we pay attention to the subtle bounds of spirit all around us and how they work. Interestingly enough, I was talking to a cannabis historian, researcher, and writer I know here in Vancouver, Canada, Chris Bennett, and he's written such books as Sex, Drugs, Violence in the Bible, and Cannabis in the Soma Solution. And he's working on a forthcoming book right now that's all about 19th century occultists like Crowley and Randolph. And he's exploring their use of hashish and other substances. And we do know, by the way, that Crowley had written diaries of a dope fiend. He was into hashish and opium and opening up into other states of consciousness to communicate with beings and spirits. But really, Bennett has done a wonderful job going into the Nag Hammadi, the Gnostic scriptures, seeing there's a connection there to Canut Bosom that he broke the story on. He's pretty famous for that, of linking the anointing oil to cannabis. And he's also looked over at the Oracle of Delphi. And again, these cases of being able to evoke spirits and various beings all come up from this. I mean, and I'm reminded of why we call alcohol spirits, because you get another influence there. But this is all a very fascinating stuff if you ever want to look at this. From an anthropology perspective even, I mean, it's incredible stuff. And the same sort of story we get by Shocked by the Bible. We get the same sort of idea of sex, drugs, and rock and roll, or sex, drugs, and violence all the way through. And this is just an amazing realization that you see that the ancient people were using these substances to open up to hyperdimensional beings and the dimensional ecology. And Terence McKenna points that out in Food of the Gods, saying that the one thing we have in common with the Mayans were mushrooms. And I don't think, that it's a prerequisite to take these substances to have a spiritual or psychic experience, but most certainly it helped our ancestors back then to get some of these cosmic breadcrumbs and to connect into those places. And of course, we know with the Native Americans, they had peyote. And in other books, we read about ayahuasca. Now, with ayahuasca, I've talked to Tobias Lars, who has retreats all the time in Peru with the shamans, and he talks about people having these incredible self-actualization experiences on ayahuasca, and they're seeing fairies and hyperdimensional beings and different intelligence that's communicating to them, and people have always reported this, which I think is really fascinating, that these things can be experienced in nature. And as Terence has pointed out too, I mean, you literally have a symbiotic connection. There is these Fibonacci sequences that communicate themselves to you, as well as, the most incredible things about psychedelic mushrooms, for example, and how they are a doorway into other dimensions, realities, and awarenesses, is that they can even get here by traveling through space, because the spores can survive in those kind of conditions, which is absolutely amazing. And there's all sorts of other ideas we get about testing spirits. Of course, Chris brings up sex magic and people having relationships with spirits as a whole other concept. But DJ Conway's Perfect Love, she talks about finding love on the astral plane. This is a topic that deserves its own video. But again, I'm not a believer that spirits would have all the answers. If they were an imperfect person in their life here, they might not be perfect on the other side, and they may not have all the answers. But in this particular concept, the author talks about a different type of spirit communication where people can connect up their chakras and have an electromagnetic energy exchange. And as we look at the traditions of ceremonial magic, we learn about all sorts of rituals that open up doors to communicate with hyperdimensional beings, angels, demons, and how sometimes those are just parts of ourselves and subconscious. But there's no doubt all sorts of intelligences in the multiverse, and we most certainly need to set our intentions when we go about doing so as we open up the doors to spirit. But now what I want to talk to you all about is what is true spiritual phenomena and what is fake or pseudoscience, the stuff that we see in the movies, the stuff that you really should stay away from and not worry about. Traditionally, there have been all sorts of fake mediums and fake psychics, going back to even the Fox sisters, who tried to trick people and give fake rapping noises. And don't get me wrong, you can have knocking noises in a real spiritual communication setting. When we look at what a seance is, and seance comes from an old French word that essentially just means to be seated or sitting down in a room, and it means something else, of course. In the English tradition, we know it's usually a group of people that are sitting in a circle. And when they are sitting in a circle, holding hands or putting their hands on the table, they usually do so at the same time every day during a week to create a quantum entanglement or to create that unifying energy, and it sort of creates an adhesive effect that brings spirit in at the same time. In true spiritual phenomena, the room might grow colder. There can be a feeling of a warmth, alternatively. You can have a feeling of being touched on the arm, or have a claircognitive thought, or smell something and feel something, clairsentience. You can see phenomena. Sometimes there's ectoplasm moving across the room, that type of an energy. Many people have these electromagnetic energy readers that will beep off as you see these paranormal hunters and these ubiquitous TV shows now that are everywhere, that are people going ghost hunting. All these things tend to happen when you're having real spiritual communications. And there's one thing that I want to tell people is that don't be afraid of what you see in the movies. There's a brand new movie out called Ouija, and the whole premise is to scare the crap out of you. And you're seeing people that are possessed, and there's all kinds of nightmares, and there's gore and all this sort of stuff. And don't get me wrong, there is the probability, when you're looking at the occult, and occult just means hidden or clandestine, that people can become thrill seekers or dabblers, and they can open themselves up to other types of phenomena, especially if they're already mentally imbalanced. But essentially, an affirmative voice of saying no, or communicating with spirit in that way is good enough to set a guideline. And I wouldn't give in to all the fear that you see in the movies. You are opening up a portal. You are opening up a door to energies, which we're going to discuss here. But with having a good and positive attitude and a strong mind and an open mind, good things will happen when you look at it. And when we look at how this phenomena works right off the bat, I want to tell you that most of our science on how this works is theoretical. Absence of proof is not proof of absence. So as we look at these various theoretical concepts of how spirit communication works, how we can use this understanding of these tools to enhance our communication, I want you to look at this evidence as such that this is a science that is always growing. I find it absolutely amazing that what we used to think was the work of quacks and charlatans is now normal in theoretical physics. Talking about hyperdimensional intelligences, the dimensional ecology of the multiverse, opening up portals to other dimensions and other realms through wormholes. We're actually looking at this stuff now in science with atom smashers and particle accelerators. I think what we're staring at is an ancient consciousness technology that has given us a very advanced phone system. And what we're going to discover as we keep going into this area is that consciousness never dies. Energy cannot be destroyed. And we're going to find better ways of understanding this as we move towards self-actualization and realizing that our destiny is in the stars. There are, believe it or not, guys that have worked on spirit communication devices. Over the years, we've heard of the Frank's box. There's another fellow that was just in the news for creating a device that he could communicate to his daughter who was showing up to him. Again, when we look at the science of how a spirit might show up to us, it might just be a neutrino light source lightly touching down on the fabric of space-time. And this guy was actually an electrical engineer, by the way. As well as we know, both Nikola Tesla and Thomas Edison had similar devices that had been made mention of that would bridge the gap of the spirit world, allow for communication. I think that this science is going to grow more and more and more exponentially. Because when you look at how a mediumship circle works or a seance circle works, as I was mentioning, people sitting in a circle around a table, or there's candles lit, and we have various elemental energies or crystals being used, and the medium is working themselves up to get this energy to come through them, we see the circle is a very important factor in this. And we also hear about the circle when we look over at UFO phenomena. We have crop circles. We hear about it in near-death experiences, people having to go through the light up through a tunnel. We hear about it in DMT, dimethyltryptamine, psychedelic experiences. We always hear in science about wormholes and black holes. Why the hole? Why the circle? Why does it go back even into the ancient Pythagoreans? And we look over at Euclid's geometry. The reason being is that when we look in science now, we know that space-time can be bent or warped and twisted. And essentially, light and motion are just space-time being bent back into itself, into a spherical configuration. So when we are creating that circle in the occult, calling a spirit or drawing it around ourselves, creating a protective circle, there's always an interdimensional sort of doorway opening up. And these universal shapes have a sort of an energy to them. Just like in pyramids, there's been studies showing that if you have a pyramid and you put razor blades inside of the pyramids or fruit, somehow this charges a universal energy so that the fruit does not spoil and the razor blades do not dull, which is absolutely fascinating. Another concept that comes to mind when we talk about energy being drawn into circles would be the 900 megalithic henges scattered around the British Isles. Obviously, the ancients knew something. As you guys have seen in the videos we just made over there at Stonehenge and around Ireland, with my Irish writer, occultist, researcher friend David Halpin, who did a fantastic job explaining these things, and he's constantly researching astrological alignments and configurations and looking into these areas deeper and further all the time. These ancient builders that were on this planet, our progenitors that were bringing all this ancient knowledge and occultism and esotericism, there was an advanced knowledge that they had with these circles. In particular, that we know that they had solstice alignments, astrological alignments. They gathered in these places. When we look underneath them, we're discovering even more with a GPR, ground penetrating radar, that they were built on ley lines. There's some very advanced configurations that we begin to see there. And we see that today with drumming circles, healing circles, the way that energy is distributed. I've been working on some new theories, working with lasers and using lasers with a light emitting diode, and seeing the physics of that, how we have these particles and photons, subatomic particles, that can cross over the multi-dimensional threshold and be able to leave an imprint on the astral, and be able to use it for opening and closing these circles, or to imprint sacred symbols on items. And that's something I'm going to discuss more in a future video, as well as I've been working on it in my writing and some advanced theories. But even Dr. Michio Kaku is talking about the use of lasers in a multi-dimensional capacity, as we now see that it's theorized how we could create a wormhole to go into other universes or other dimensions would be to tear the fabric of space-time using a powerful enough laser, and then this would create a micro wormhole, which we would inject nanobots to open that up. I also want to point out that the circle is not the only sacred geometry used in this ancient consciousness technology. We know that, for example, the pentagram is often used, and the pentagram is just the sigil of Venus, or the sigil of man. It's got the 5 elements. It also is the exact configuration that Venus moves in, and the ancients knew this. It is used often for banishing when we draw it from the left bottom part and draw it upwards in front of us, or on items in magic and occult circles, such as what we see in the Golden Dawn and other traditions with the lesser banishing ritual of the pentagrams. When it's drawn the other way, we see an invocation property, as well as with the hexagram, the 6-pointed star. And this is often used to draw in these energies. And there are universal properties to geometry that we see all around us. Again, this is pointed out by the ancient Pythagoreans, by Euclid's geometry. And I also want to point out religious iconography. I mean, look at the cross. This is a very ancient symbol. We know that Plato was describing it with the ancient Atlanteans. Dagon, Oannes, Nimrod, Sidon, however you want to call them. He had this ancient cross, much like the Templar cross. We also see it with Quetzalcoatl, Culhuacan, Zoltan, and the Mesoamerican, Aztec, and other traditions. This cross goes back a long ways, one of the oldest being the Tao. So many different versions of it. It's the cycles of light, the cycles of the sun. The Celtic cross is the shorthand for this, with the cross with the circle in the middle of it, the 4 cycles of the year of the sun. And the ancient mystery schools, going back and even into the ancient Eleusinian mysteries, which is one of the greatest of all the mystery schools in the world, they knew about these mysteries, and all these things have been trickled down into the religions of the world and passed down as keys and initiations, that once you get past the pageantry that is clouded by the superstitious and the ignorant, there are powerful clues for those that are seeking immortality and the initiations of the light. But within these principles and concepts is how these symbols become sacred, and they hold the keys to the light. When there was a recent study done, what they did is they crossed 2 beams of light and created a quantum hologram of a photon, and it was in the shape of the Templar cross, which I think is very interesting. And we also see this same logic applied to why vibratory qualities of names are so important in this work. And it is because that when we look at what a thought form is, and that's how many people over the ages, billions of people believing in a god or a goddess or a name or a symbol, because as the old axiom teaches us, everything has the seed of everything. Thoughts become things, and energy follows thoughts. So there is a certain sacred geometry to our universe that comes into play here. And geometry is all around us, by the way. It's in everything, including our words. There's a sacred geometry to words and vibratory quality, and also into a dimensional quality. Now, we also have to look at the concept of how consciousness works to understand how spiritual communication would be possible in the first place. First of all, what is consciousness? I've explained this many times in other videos, but I'm going to give it to you here again. Consciousness is a non-local awareness, in my opinion. We have a locality and non-locality factor of when we bring this into the equation. And of course, we have to go look at the fascinating work of Sir Roger Penrose, the famed British physicist, and Stuart Hameroff over at the University of Tucson in Arizona. Now, these gentlemen have a theory called ORC, quantum consciousness. And they have looked at our brain as having this microgirder structure with microtubules, and they have looked at consciousness operating at the most infinitesimally small levels and scales in the universe, going back into the fundamental basics of space-time geometry, that this is where everything in the universe tends to happen. And so when we look how consciousness would work, there's sort of a cockpit when it could work and come through the body. Essentially, it holds itself together through quantum cohesion or superpositioning. So if you die, this part of you, these atoms and structures can come back together, and you can exist in this way. Now, as I explained in my Afterlife Science video, there is another way that we learn about death and how this phenomena works when we look at what the Buddha said in the Dharmapada, or the last great discourse, when we learn about the chakras, or the electromagnetic energy points of the body. We'll learn about when the body is dying, just as Buddha died in the last great discourse. We read all about these things. Essentially, what happened is that our body detaches down by where the solar plexus and whatnot is happening, up the vagus or the pneumogastric nerve, and it starts to bring up these subtle bounds of energy when the inferior goes to the superior, and we exit out the crown of the head. And we have all sorts of stories, incredible ones to draw from, with near-death experience stories and physicians. And if you're a skeptic and you're watching this and you're looking at this with a closed mind, you're probably saying, well, all these near-death experience stories, these are all just guys that are having hallucinations. Well, that phenomena known as hypoxia is when you're having a lack of oxygen to the brain, and actually there's been test studies where such scenarios have been replicated, and the hallucinations had from these did not have the long-lasting positive effect that near-death experience survivors experience and what they relay, which is really quite fascinating. Now, I also want to talk about what happens in the body and the brain of the medium or the mediator that's doing these sort of spiritual communications. First of all, when we examine meditation, and there's been many Buddhist monks that have submitted for testing in this, and we've looked at brain scans and looked at the way that the body responds, that there is a shift in the prefrontal cortex of the brain and how we process experiences and how we view ourselves, and with gray matter, that there are all sorts of neurons firing up and in fascinating activity that we start to see on a brain level, as well as we know that within the body we see all sorts of electrical changes in people that are meditating and how this energy transforms. In fact, when you study psychology, especially when we look at sort of Ericksonian ideas, we also see these ideas with clinical hypnotherapy. That right now, as I'm talking to you guys, I'm in a beta or hyper beta mode, and my brainwaves are oscillating faster. When you're reading a book and you're going through some information slowly, or you're watching television, you're in a lighter, more relaxed state. You're going into your alpha state, and then you move down into theta, and in your most profound levels of sleep, you're in delta. And it's very interesting, as we come up as kids, we actually go the backwards way. We're in delta as very small children, and we're in the most profound state of these brain waves and the actual state that we're in, and we move up in backwards, back up into the thetas and alphas and betas, and as we are teenagers, we fluctuate back and forth between those various levels, which is why when you're doing therapy, you have to go backwards into these subconscious levels to cure, let's say, something like addiction, which is a neural adaptation or obsessive compulsive disorder that lodges itself in one of those states or one of those areas of brainwaves. So when we're tapping into spiritual communication, there's so much activity going on that is happening in the body that somebody has become proficient at this. And as I mentioned, two terms, they're mediumship, and when we look at what a full trance medium is, or a mediator, we start to see a lot of these terms being used in our occult, metaphysical, New Age literature. Of course, we have some of these definitions over here. This is Alan Kardec's book, The Book of Mediums. We see the Solitary Seance book by Buckland. Raymond Buckland famously wrote books on witchcraft. And we see stuff by Anna Riva, How to Have a Seance here. A lot of the techniques that you guys will read about in there will say that you could become a full trance medium, which is someone that develops very deep states of trance so that they can feel themselves dropping lower and lower, and so a spirit can come into them and come through the vessel and communicate to them and through them. And sometimes you'll hear their voice change. You'll see body characteristics change as the person that was there before. And many authors, such as Ted Andrews, have had several admonishments about this, that, while it's a great thing to develop and go towards, if you have any imbalances, if a person doesn't have a great health or auric or bioelectromagnetic field, if they have a lot of imbalances and abuse drugs and alcohol and whatnot, they can develop holes in this auric field, in this energy field, and these energies can play upon them. Now, that's a key word right there as well when I mention energy, because that's what I believe we are really composed of. We know that we look at the spooky action or the spooky theory that Einstein brought up, and what we see in physics, that atoms can be at two places at once in the universe, that we know that there is everything is operating through energy, that nothing is really solid, everything is in constant motion around us, that there is a sort of electromagnetic charge, everything is magnetism. And we know that, and that's how some of these tools in spiritual practices and spiritism work. And that's why I'd also like to bring up with you what you're going to see on the table as spiritual aids. Now, these spiritual aids have been used by people in the occult, magic, and psychic circles for some time, and include, your essential oils, your incense and candles. And you may ask, what good are these for? Well, if we go and look back to the likes of Paracelsus, who is a Swiss-born occultist, astrologer, physician, toxicologist, Swiss German actually, and his real name was Philippus Areolus Theophrastus Bombastus von Heinem, but that's what we call him, Paracelsus for short. It's much easier to remember. He started to not only map out different spiritual kingdoms to do with nature and the elementals in the mineral kingdom, but also the essential oils. And essential oils are a good place to look at that. We see that many essential oils have a certain quality or a harmonic resonance or a vibration to them, which can aid people in spirit communication in more ways than one. And one of those theories is that it changes the vibratory energy in the room, just like incenses. And this has been used in a very, very long time, even going back into the ancient world with frankincense and myrrh, to using incense in the ancient temples, not only from Solomon and the temples of Egypt, and even in the stories in ancient Greece, we hear a story about rose. And with the rose oil, this is still used in banquet halls today in Greece, and it goes back into Greece mythology in this story where Venus and Adonis wanted to keep their relationship a secret, and so Cupid took rose to the god of silence to keep the relationship a secret. But it's often harmonious with bringing up love and good energy and having a positive psychological effect on the person. Gardenia was often used, which is a very important oil. And of course, we get honeysuckle, which is one of my favorite oils. If you have honeysuckle oil, occultists had long since known that having that brought about certain inspiration. Lemon, again, a lemon goes back into seance circles as being very cleansing and purifying. Lavender, of course, is always relaxing. And rosemary is always used for people who want to remember and want to stimulate the memory. But again, we have so many here that are very purifying. I would say, outside of sandalwood being one of the most famous, most popular of all time, I'd say another very cleansing and relaxing one would be eucalyptus. But there's so many to choose from. I've collected countless bottles of essentials oils over the years, and I absolutely love them. They were even used throughout the Middle Ages. We know with things like thieves' oil. And then, of course, when we look over at Native American traditions and in many other groups, use white sage. And with white sage, it is very cleansing and purifying. And when you use it in such a way, you would use a feather to essentially bring it around the body, the auric field, the room, to purify everything around you, and it changes that harmonic resonance. And I've also seen some people use salt in a room, especially people that are these ghost hunters, they call themselves, where they'll spread salt all over the place, and we know that there's a certain conductive energy that happens with salt when it is spread around, and it's said that it disrupts for them. Now, the candle has always been very important in the occult. The candle has all the elements. You have fire, water, earth, air, all these things around, and the various colors have been used in what they call candle magic. Usually the candles are anointed, but the various colors in the candles have certain purposes when used, and they come in all sorts of different colors, and people will spread them around. They've always been known to be sacred. Even the ancient philosophers, looked at the elements, going back even into Thales, and we had the ancient philosophical symbol of fire and water, and bringing about a powerful correspondence to these. People have said all kinds of incantations and words to bring about these beings. In the Golden Dawn tradition, they always said before starting work, "Hecus, Hecus, este Babala," and this comes back from the ancient Greek Eleusinian mystery schools, which essentially means afar, profane, like get out of here, things that we don't want. But as I mentioned, it is Halloween, and traditionally this has been a special time for all the witches and occultists and psychics that want to have special practices. And you might ask, why is that? Well, when we were in Ireland recently, what they would tell us is that Halloween in Ireland was a very special time traditionally, because it was believed that's when the Troopin' Fairies would come out and they would cause mischief. The veils of the spiritual dimensions were thinner. In Irish tradition, we learn about tween times, or a tween place, when it's dusk or dawn, or you're in the middle of a bridge, it's neither up nor down, and different places that you can see through the veil of when spirit comes into our world. And it's no exception between the various equinoxes and the seasons. And this is very true of Samhain, Samhain, Halloween. They would actually carve turnips, which later became pumpkins, to scare off various mischievous spirits. But it's always been thought that this was a key focal point, and there are still people all over the world that call it All Souls Day, and a time to celebrate loved ones that have crossed, or invite them to dinner with you. There is something very special that happens this time of the year. There's no doubt about it. And I believe it all comes back to the ideas we learned from the fundamentals of space-time geometry. Matter, space, and time are all arranged in the tiniest of scales. So we see this convergence taking place in space-time, that these energies come together, hence what we see with quantum entanglement when people come together at the same time for a seance, or when there's astrotheology involved, astrological alignments, something to do with energy, something to do with gravity pulls, as we know that there are gravity shifts between different dimensions, and they can be measured with nano-gravitational measuring tools. We know this is very important. We also learned about something known as the witching hour. Traditionally, people have said that spirit contact was easier between 12 and 3 a.m. or the late hours. And I have always thought this was a very plausible theory, because everyone's sleeping during those hours, so there's less brainwave activity, so there's less electromagnetic activity around us, so there's more quietude, and when thoughts can transcend. There's some wisdom that I'm reminded of from the ancient Bhagavad Gita. And the Gita, it says, to the sage, the daytime is nighttime and the nighttime is daytime. Meaning, so when everyone is running around in the daytime and they're running around like a chicken with their head cut off, and they don't know what they're going to do next, they're gossiping about the Kardashians, they're going to work, they're doing all these various errands, they're in cruise control mode. Whereas at night, everything kind of slows down, and that's when the sage really starts to think and become illuminated, when the sage is in that mode of going into that quietude and that inner reflexivity, whereas everyone else is in this chaotic mess during the day. So it's very interesting that we pull those concepts together. These are some things to keep in mind. Now, there are other energies and spirits and beings that people have called on using the zodiac or zodiacal properties in astrotheology, so they'll pay attention to a certain day of the week. Many have often looked at moon cycles, which is why we get the name Luna, lunacy. They become a lunatic, how that's associated with Monday. Again, the day of the week associated, lundi in French, for that sort of property. But many will pay attention to moon charts for spirit communication in the occult. And the moon charts, depending on what you're trying to perform or what kind of intuitive insights you want or what kind of being, some will say that you get a lot of psychic energy on a full moon or a dark moon. Others will have certain communications that they might be trying to do maybe in their dreams, or they'll be looking at a waning moon or waxing. So these are things that you can look up and also correspond with. Others have worked with crystal balls and crystals to look at energy and scrying with these things. This is an obsidian ball, which has been used for a very long time, that is, sort of strengthening and kind of breaks away the nonsense and the negativity. And going back into these cleansing methods, there are all sorts of things. These are these Tibetan prayer bells. So some have rang these to set a vibratory quality to the room, or as a group said a prayer. And as I mentioned, there is a quantum entanglement factor when you're working with people in a group, and people are working to do mediumship, and they're doing seances, that getting together at the same time every week, having a set time, a set goal, having names is very important. There's an electromagnetism factor to this. Everything has an energy signature to it. And as I mentioned, my friend Matthew Stapley at the beginning of the video, he's worked on missing persons cases. I've talked to some very gifted psychics who have done missing persons cases with the police and other groups, and this is real. I mean, you guys can go back and see the interview I did with Derek White Sky Cloud. I mean, he does this work as well. And, when we see how that phenomena works, usually there's psychometry involved, where an object will be picked up and the psychic will feel the object on their solar plexus. They'll put it next to their solar plexus and they'll feel the energy, because that's where we say we're having a gut feeling. That's where they'll have it. So it's quite common when having a seance or a spirit communication session that a person will bring about an object, and they will feel it or use it, a picture of the person, to have sort of a photon or ionic kind of charge of where that person was, who they were, and address their energy that way. And again, if you guys watch my afterlife science video I did, we talked a little bit about how spirit communication works, how people sometimes come back to visit us after they've died, and some incredible stories like the Billy Fingers story talk about that, which is absolutely amazing. So while we have talked about almost all of the methods of spirit communication, there are a few others. I have a system I developed a few years ago called Spirit Email, where I believe if you use a pen or a cell phone and just like a memo app where you can just write out various ideas, you can create a connection to a spirit being, like a prayer, and feel that energy, because I believe spirit's always listening and are always around us and always a part of our lives. And you can essentially write a letter to them, and write the letter as if you're writing it to a best friend or someone that's in your life, and you will get a reply. It's very interesting how that will happen. You might be getting a claircognizant thought that all of a sudden it will just be repetitive over and over again. You'll have the answer to a question or an update of how someone was doing. Another interesting thing that might happen is that you'll get a visitation in a dream. In the dream state, we get all sorts of fascinating visitations. And again, in my last video that I did on the afterlife science, I did explain how the physicists these days are teaching us the ideas that we do have a multiverse around us, a multidimensional reality around us, and we look at this through all these various strings and subatomic particles. And it goes back even further that we learned about these concepts to the laws of harmonics from the Pythagoreans, that essentially that everything works like the chromatic scale of music around us. And mathematically, even though we know mathematically that we can comfortably go up to the 11th and 12th dimension, and that in every universe in the multiverse that we're potentially looking at a 12 by 12 model that has 12 dimensions at each side of each dimension, and then we create 144 per universe, but I think there are infinite dimensions. So these realms of spirit are all around us, and in fact we see other great studies about this through Dr. Rick Strassman's work on DMT, dimethyltryptamine, operating through the pineal gland, the third eye that the ancients knew about, that's in the shape of a pine cone, which is also why at the Vatican we have the pine cone out in the courtyard. The pontiff has it on top of his staff, and again, it is one of the most sacred and ancient of teachings, even mentioned in Manly P. Hall's Secret Teachings of All Ages. The reason the pineal gland is so important in this hypothesis is that is where your DMT, or your dimethyltryptamine, is created, which Strassman coined as the spirit molecule. It's also, by the way, where serotonin is created when light hits your eyes in the morning, when you wake up, when you go to bed at night and your room is dark. That's why you create melatonin. We've had this confirmed by finding DMT in the pineal glands of rats. And what's very interesting in Strassman's studies, that people that had DMT administered to them, which is the strongest psychedelic known to man, by the way, it's found in everything in nature, it's in all of us, it's in grass, it's in bark, it's in trees. And what happens is that people have these profound hyperspace, out-of-body experiences, communicating with multi-dimensional intelligence, and your brain is literally flooded with this stuff when you're dying. When you're having dreams, you're having this stuff come through you. It's like the lubricant of other dimensions. It's at the top of the endocrine glands, by the way, the pineal gland. It operates just like an eye, like a cornea on a lens, hence the term that we use colloquially for it, the third eye. And what's really spectacular about this is that this number 7 has always been sacred. And there's so many different 7s that we see in the world, the 7 deadly sins, the 7 liberal arts and sciences. We see the cycles of 7 in nature. However, we also see here that there are 7 endocrine glands. And this comes all throughout the ancient religious and spiritual mythologies. But it's very fascinating that here we have another mechanism that this might happen. We also see the age-old debate that took place between people looking at the theories of Hippocrates, the father of modern medicine, and Descartes, that their difference of opinion was the spiritual doorway to the brain, the cerebral cortex, the walnut-shaped part of the brain, or was it in the pineal gland? So within these communications, we also learn about mediatorship, which is something that almost anybody can do with a little practice. If you want to have a spiritual experience, the great Ted Andrews always taught in his books, such as The Intercession of Spirits, to spend time alone. if you spend time alone, draw that circle around you, or go out in nature, you'll have a spiritual experience. Ask for signs. Test the spirits. Ask them to save you a parking spot. You can learn to do an exercise to meet a spirit guide. Many people believe that we have a spirit guide that comes into this life with us, and an angel. And angels are ubiquitous again, by the way, all throughout the ancient world, all around the world. Angel comes from the Greek angelos, which is just a messenger. And again, one of my favorite books in the world was by Ted Andrews, and he wrote How to Meet and Work with Spirit Guides. And I really think that there is a real benefit to working with these energies and to understanding ourselves and seeing that there's so much magic and wonder and mysticism to discover in the world. Again, it was Einstein that said the most beautiful thing we can experience is the mysterious. It is the source of all art and science. He to whom this emotion is a stranger, who can no longer pause to wonder and stand wrapped in awe, is as good as dead, his eyes as closed. And I want to show you guys one more thing. This is what Ted Andrews suggests to use in his book, The Intercession of Spirits. He talks about using prayer shawls, or the concept of a magic carpet, of charging up an electromagnetic intention into this thing every day. You put it around yourself and use a prayer shawl for, let's say, an astral projection, or leaving the body, or doing spirit communication. And by using this, it has that set intention that's something that is going to enhance an imprint or a memory on your auric field. And again, we must remember that these concepts of using items and robes and plants and whatnot come even back into the ancient Druids. The Druids, who, by the way, were instructed by the ancient Chaldeans that came there. This is very interesting. When Julius Caesar had come to England, in ancient England, we know that there was already a London. It was a Ludon from the sun god, and the Romans called it Londinium. Julius Caesar essentially said, Veni Vidi Vici. I came, I saw, I conquered. And he recognized that there was a Stonehenge there, and there was these mystical people known as the Druids. And the Druids, he thought, had built this thing, but we know in other Roman records and in the Druidic universities, they were actually instructed by these very same ancient Chaldeans who probably came in by boat, and the rest is history. So all sorts of incredible, strange, magical energies. And by the way, again, I believe that the ancient Chaldeans probably got their mystical teachings from the Atlanteans, who are really our progenitors on this planet that have passed down so much mystical knowledge. There is so much here to look at, and in so many ways this knowledge can enhance your life. And whether you decide to do mediumship work, or just work with spirit in a subtle way in your life, or communicate with a loved one who's passed on, or have a communication with them as a mediator and give a message to someone, this working with this energy can most certainly change and enhance your life. And I want to hear from all of you. Have you had a spiritual experience that's changed your life? Maybe you felt like someone was watching you before, or you had a dream where a deceased loved one came to visit you and gave you a message. Let us know in the comments. Like, subscribe, and please share this video. And most of all, happy Halloween.